Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Two months into the Great Trade War and inflation is still falling. As Zero Hedge put it, we will have to wait until next month to see the hyperinflationary hellscape our pundits and government-funded Ph.D. economists so confidently promised. Last week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported CPI inflation for the month of May once again came in at an annual rate of just 1.2%. That brings inflation in the 4 months since Donald Trump took office to just 1.4%, which is 1/5 Biden's final read. That's also substantially below the Fed's target of 2%. As in right now, inflation is too low, according to the Fed's own decades-long standard. Now, May numbers matter because it was the first real test of tariff war pass-through on prices. Markets expected about twice as much inflation on the month. Instead, it was about as low as you can get without getting rid of the central bank, when the trade war was supposed to force you into a second mortgage to afford new socks. Now, we're not out of the woods yet. The Fed's so-called Beige Book survey of economic anecdotes found companies expecting higher costs as tariffs get built into prices instead of companies eating the tariffs, but so far it ain't happening. In fact, prices fell in the categories most exposed to tariffs. So last month, clothing prices dropped 5% annualized, furniture fell almost 10% annualized. Both new and used car prices are also falling. Those were supposed to be ground zero for tariffs. Now, the other big price drop last month was energy, with gasoline prices falling 2.6% on the month. That's an annual rate of something like a 1/3 drop in gas prices. The reason was partly OPEC pumping more oil, which was a Saudi thank you for Trump's support against Iran, which might now ironically reverse with Israel bombing Iran. But cheap gas had a big assist, ironically enough, from tariffs, as plunging Chinese and European exports put their economies on the edge of recession. Recession reduces their oil demand. In other words, tariffs hike import prices, but they partly cancel by putting China into recession, which is fun. So what's next? The $64,000 question is, what will the Fed do with these inflation numbers? Will it continue using tariffs as an excuse to strangle the Trump boom with historically high interest rates? Or does the Fed return to its 112-year stance of cutting rates early and often, especially with inflation below target? Prediction market Kalshi is currently projecting just a 0.5 point of cuts for the rest of the year, meaning markets expect the Fed to keep rates at one of the highest levels in 25 years, despite inflation being too low. Perhaps the Fed keeps strangling all the way into the midterms when Jerome Powell could hand the House to Democrats if he can just kill enough American jobs with high interest rates. Jerome Powell is already moving the goalposts. In last week's Fed Minutes, he is talking about waiting until we see 2026 inflation, or even 2027. That's not just moving the goalposts, it is planting them in the next town. Unless this changes, tariffs will be the excuse for Jerome to fight Trump through the midterms, yet another deep state sabotage with millions of American jobs as collateral damage. The Federal Reserve is set to pay $1.1 trillion to major banks, effectively paying them interest on the money that's already in their vaults. A new bill would end it. Last week, Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz introduced a bill to end the Fed's so-called Interest on Reserves program, where the Fed pays interest on the dollars banks are required to deposit with the Fed. So what happens is the Fed prints money to finance federal deficits and artificially boost the economy, both of which generate fat profits on Wall Street. It does this by pushing interest rates below market and with something called quantitative easing, where it literally makes up imaginary money, uses it to buy stuff, putting the money into circulation. But the Fed knows that all that money creation also creates inflation, so it turns around and pays those same banks to park some of the new money at the Fed. So it's a giant self-licking ice cream cone that siphons nearly $200 billion a year from everybody who holds dollars. Now, up till the 2008 crisis, banks did not earn any interest on their reserves. After all, reserves are supposed to be like money in the vault, backing deposits. Bankers already had the exorbitant privilege of only needing to keep 10 cents on the dollar in the vault as reserves, with the Fed and Treasury standing ready to bail out the other 90 cents at taxpayer cost. But all that changed in 2008 when banks proved so reckless that they threatened to topple our entire financial system, at which point they were punished by getting interest on their reserves. The scam exploded during COVID, so in 2019, banks were parking about $2 trillion at the Fed, paying just 0.1% interest. So the Fed was paying banks $2 billion a year. 5 years later, that has grown to $3.5 trillion, paying 4.5% interest. So that's $187 billion per year. In fact, these interest payments now make up most of the profits of the entire American banking system. $187 billion interest versus $270 billion of bank profits. So 70 cents on the banker dollar siphoned directly out of your life savings, with a fat slab going to foreign banks. It is a big club and you ain't in it. Now, the Fed claims it needs to pay interest in order to soak up all the dollars the Fed printed. Of course, they don't phrase it that way. Remember, the Fed pretends money printing has nothing to do with inflation. In their world, inflation falls out of the sky, caused by greedy workers, greedy supply chains, animal spirits, boats stuck in the Suez, with the Fed heroically jumping in to pay bankers strip club tabs to keep the republic from collapsing. As James Grant put it, the arsonist pretending to be firemen. So what's next? Ted Cruz's bill probably won't pass since bankers know how campaign donations work. But what if Congress stopped paying bankers strip club tabs? In short, roughly $1 trillion would flow out of reserves and into lending to business and customers. This would lower the interest rate on loans, mortgages, even government debt, and a good chunk would go to creating jobs. And I could nudge inflation since the frozen reserves were hiding part of Bidenflation, but then in recent videos I mentioned inflation is currently way below the Fed's target, while job growth could certainly use that money better than using it to siphon profits to bankers. Of course, with 70% of Wall Street profits in play, bank lobbyists will be burning up the steak dinners and campaign donations to keep it going. A word from our sponsor. The United States now has a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It's not speculation, it's official policy. Unchained and the Bitcoin Policy Institute are breaking it all down in a new report with a live panel called The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Era Begins. If you care about the future of Bitcoin, you'll want to be there. Visit unchained.com/PSO to register and read the report. If you own gold or silver, you know they're a great hedge against financial instability and let you grow your wealth outside the banking system and gain greater control over your finances. Monetary Metals offers you the ability to increase your precious metal ounces every single month. Instead of paying to own metal, with Monetary Metals, you get paid 4% on your gold paid in more ounces. Now's the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset that the government cannot inflate away. Join thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn more. Now back to our show. War in Iran could drive oil prices to $300 a barrel, according to Iraq's foreign minister. That's about 5 times higher than today, implying $12 gasoline and 10% inflation. So will it happen? The first point is Iraq's government is sympathetic to Iran. Yes, we spent $1 trillion giving Iraq to Iran. So they want to hype oil price Armageddon to scare Donald Trump. But even in the real world, JP Morgan estimates an actual war in Iran could double oil prices to $130 per barrel, which would imply $5 gasoline and 5% inflation. Deutsche Bank and Mizuho are also around 120 to 150. The only way it gets remotely close to 300 is if there is a total blockade of the Persian Gulf. Now, this is possible in theory. The Gulf has a tiny 6-mile wide shipping lane on Iran's coast, the Strait of Hormuz, 6 miles being roughly the Hudson River in New York. Still, Israel is apparently very good at neutralizing threats, while even scuttled ships can be moved in a week or two if 300 oil is the alternative. Having said whether it's 130 or 300, a ground war in Iran would be a big hit to oil prices. How big? There are 2 ways to look at it: flows of oil and prices of oil. These are different because even if your country doesn't use Persian Gulf oil, world markets are fungible. Oil moves around. meaning a shortage in one place drives up prices every place. So in terms of flow, almost all Persian Gulf oil goes to Asia and Europe. So losing that supply does nothing to America, we just buy more Texan. It isn't catastrophic to Europe either. Persian Gulf oil is just 6% of their oil supply. So the main victim is China, who imports 10 times more Persian Gulf oil than America does, making up 1/3 of all the oil China uses, with very few untapped domestic sources. The rest of Asia is similar, so India, Korea, Japan, Singapore are all almost totally reliant on the Persian Gulf. So a blockade is a big deal for China and Asia, but it is not our problem. What is our problem is prices. Even $130 oil would wipe out Trump's inflation wins, bringing inflation back up to 4 or 5% if it lasts. Now, given the Fed is already using tariffs as an excuse for higher rates, $130 oil pushes them to hike even more, strangling the economy and Trump. Now, so far, even 130 is unlikely. Since Israel started bombing Iran, world oil prices have only moved $5 to 72 a barrel, meaning markets do not expect a wider war in Iran. Rather, more of what we're seeing, surgical bombings and surgical assassinations to destabilize the regime. None of those have a major impact on oil, especially considering that oil exports are the only thing paying the soldiers in Iran. As in, the more vulnerable the Iranian regime, the less likely they want to blockade. So what's next? Iran's proxies will talk up oil prices, but so long as the war remains surgical, we will not see life-changing oil prices. Of course, if that changes to American boots on the ground, a whole lot of things will get messy from oil to financial markets, enough that it could completely derail Trump's boom. Two new studies find self-deportations are running 5 to 10 times the number of formal deportations, suggesting north of 1 million illegals could already be gone. In case you wonder why the Home Depot parking lot no longer looks like a Guatemalan bus station. In Trump's first 4 months, he's deported about 140,000 illegals, which is about 1,500 a day. That's roughly half what he had hoped, partly because left-wing judges and lawfare litigating every deportation while left-wing rioters throw rocks, urine, and fortified fireworks at ICE agents. And it's partly because the administration is pursuing a worst-first strategy of going after hardened criminals, which are manpower-intensive, and ICE only has so many agents. Still, 1,500 is disappointing. At that rate, Trump would deport maybe 2 million in his entire term, something like 1 in 10 illegals. The administration's recently tried to ramp this up towards 3,000 a day, which is more respectable, but it's actually a lot better because several new studies estimate that for every person ICE hauls off, another 5 to 10 are leaving voluntarily for fear of being hauled off. So one study from Trend Macro estimates 773,000 illegals have left since Trump took office. It's about 5 times more than formal deportations and comes to about 7,000 per day. The Washington Post estimates 1 million workers have self-deported, which implies closer to 1.6 million people. So that would be about 15,000 per day. Now, if these numbers are real and if they continue, Trump could get rid of more than half of illegals. The Washington Post number implies Trump could pretty much get them all. Now, I mentioned in previous videos how self-deportation is where the action is. America's had 3 mass deportations in the 20th century under Wilson, FDR, and Eisenhower. In all 3 cases, voluntary deportations swamp official ones. For FDR and Eisenhower, is about 10 to 1. So these studies of 5 to 10 self-deportations for every ICE deportee are pretty much on track. Now, the administration knows this, which is why they've been encouraging self-deportation. The mobile app that Biden used to assembly line 900,000 illegals into America was flipped into a deportation app where illegals can announce their imminent departure in return for getting deprioritized by ICE. This was paired with a number of carrots to go with the deportation stick, so illegals now get cost-free travel home, a $1,000 exit bonus, and forgiveness of fines that otherwise accrue at $998 per day of illegal residence, along with a promise that self-deportations can apply for future legal re-entry compared to forced deportation where you get a lifetime ban. So what's next? While free flights are a nice touch, the biggest driver of self-deportations is cutting off the money. That means aggressively going after employers who knowingly employ illegals, which is already illegal but unenforced, and yes, that includes hotels and farmers. It also means cutting off the flood of government benefits that go to illegals. One study pegs these at $182 billion a year, 6 times what illegals pay in taxes. And it's not just federal. In California, New York, and Hawaii, they get free health care and even cash assistance that Americans don't get. Trump's already going after these in a series of executive orders, and DOGE has made it a lot easier to identify illegal benefits. The left, of course, will litigate every step because at this point their only hope is replacing American voters with illegals they hope to eventually amnesty into a permanent blue bloc. Happily, for now at least, they are losing. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. And you can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Bidenflation is over, but if you feel like prices still are not falling, you are not alone. Since Donald Trump took office, inflation has plunged from a Biden-era 5% to just 1.4%. That's actually below the Fed's target of 2%, as in normally at this point the Fed would be trying to pump inflation because it's too low. Of course, for the American people, 1.4% is not too low. What they want is falling prices, as in take it back to pre-Biden prices. So will that happen? In short, no. In fact, prices will never durably fall until we get rid of the Federal Reserve. The betting odds on Kalshi are currently running 0.5% for 2025 deflation, so 99.5% they rise, even with Trump making inflation too low. The reason is that deflation, falling prices, is the number one thing the Fed fears. Not unemployment, not recession, not nuclear war. This comes from the core propaganda that created central banks, the claim that deflation itself is bad. In reality, there are two very different kinds of deflation. The healthy deflation you automatically get from a growing economy, and the unhealthy deflation when a central bank financial bubble collapses. So walking through, inflation is about how much money is chasing how much goods. More money gives you inflation, too much money chasing goods. More goods gives you deflation. The money is chasing lots and lots of goods. So if your economy is growing, it means you're producing more goods, so it takes fewer dollars to buy an apple. Deflation. That means deflation is good. It means you're growing. But there's a second bad deflation. This is where the amount of goods doesn't change, the amount of money collapses. Specifically, defaults that collapse money substitutes we lovingly call debt. That means the surviving dollars also buy more, not because there's more apples, but because there's effectively a lot less money. Now, this normally doesn't happen. You don't get massive economy-wide defaults unless there is a financial crisis. What causes financial crises? Ironically enough, central banks. They do this by making money artificially cheap with low interest rates and quantitative easing, then slamming the brakes when the cheap money causes inflation. The central bank boom-bust cycle. Slamming the brakes causes widespread bankruptcies and defaults, so there's less money, and it causes recessions, so there's less goods. But in practice, the defaults far outrun the production. So less stuff, but a lot less money. Now, sometimes this can be very big. In the 1990 depression and 1929 depressions, prices dropped by 30 to 40%, so a dollar bought almost twice what it used to. Nowadays, debt deflations are much smaller. It peaked at 2% in the 2008 crisis, because nowadays central banks immediately jump in to dump freshly printed money into markets. So setting aside the hilarious irony that the Fed fights good deflation specifically because it causes bad deflation, this also means that even after a catastrophic inflation, like Bidenflation or the 1970s, the Fed will never let prices come back down. So what's next? Central banking is an inflation factory that never pays you back. Happily, there are two solutions: either back the dollar with gold or Bitcoin, so it's harder for the Fed to inflate and cause financial crises, or, ideally, get rid of the Fed altogether. Let markets set rates, let banks bail themselves out, and let that sweet sunshine of deflation make us rich again. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.